Mind Rescue Kit, Part 2. Control your inner dialogue. What am I saying now? Whether you've noticed it or not, we all talk to ourselves on the inside. Now, I'm not talking about crazy people with voices in their heads that tell them to kill, kill, kill. I'm talking about the questions, comments, and instructions you give yourself on the inside. This is called your internal dialogue. Everybody has one. What makes a difference is what you're saying to yourself and how you say it. For starters, do you have an inner cheerleader or an inner critic? What I mean is, does your internal dialogue say, go for it, and well done? Or does it say, oh, you're hopeless, and I'll never get it right? I don't know about you, but if someone followed me around all day and criticized everything I did, I'd soon be feeling miserable and hopeless. It's only natural. So why do that to yourself on the inside? Let's find out more about what you do on the inside. Do the following exploration and be completely honest with yourself. In later sections, I'll show you how to improve your internal dialogue. Explore. What do you say to yourself? Do you tell yourself off? Do you make excuses for yourself? Do you give yourself advice in a hostile tone of voice? Do you say anything encouraging, supportive, or motivating? Be mindful of your internal dialogue for a day, tracking what you say to yourself and how you say it. Stop it. Now you know a bit more about your personal internal dialogue. Truth be told, most people could benefit from some improvement. Before we get to that, here's an emergency technique to help you if it gets bad in there. I remember working with a client who got panic attacks in public places. It turned out that when he went out in public, his inner voice began screaming in his ear until he went somewhere more private. This made his problem really easy to understand. If my internal dialogue did that, I'd probably have panic attacks too. So I asked him, have you ever thought about not doing that? His jaw dropped and he looked at me blankly. Then he started laughing. What? He asked. He'd never really considered that he had a choice in the matter. How? So I took him through the following technique, which kick-started the change he needed. Explore. Pick a situation from the past where you gave yourself a really thorough telling off. Run through the situation, and when your internal dialogue starts to get negative, say stop on the inside. Make it loud and sudden. If your internal dialogue starts up again, say stop again. Keep interrupting the negative internal dialogue until it totally stops. Reframe with rescue questions. Now you can stop a negative internal dialogue, it's time to start a positive one in its place. What's positive? Let me first tell you the tale of Don Pedro. Don Pedro was a poor farmer who lived with his son in a shack on a small plot of stony land. One day he was out walking and he found a cloth bag on the road. The bag was full of seeds. His neighbour said, Don Pedro, how wonderful. Now you can grow some food which will feed you through the winter. What a blessing. Don Pedro just shrugged and said, maybe. So he laboured over the next weeks, clearing stones and weeds from the soil, planting and nurturing the seeds until he had several rows of green shoots. The next day they were all gone. His neighbour said, Don Pedro, how dreadful. You've worked so hard and all for nothing. Curse the very day you found those seeds. Don Pedro just shrugged and said, maybe. So he sat up the next night to see if he could find out what had happened to the seeds. And as dark descended, he heard a strange harumphing noise. The next morning found Don Pedro standing with a beautiful white horse that he'd captured in the night, the same horse that had eaten his crops. His neighbour said, Don Pedro, how wonderful. Now you can travel to town and back quickly, and this beast can be used to plough the land. What a blessing. Don Pedro just shrugged and said, maybe. The next day, Don Pedro's son fell from the horse and broke his arm. His neighbour said, Don Pedro, how dreadful. There's so much work to do and your son is injured and he can't help you. Curse the very day you found that horse. Don Pedro just shrugged and said, maybe. Several days later, the army arrived in the village, conscripting boys for war. Don Pedro's son, being injured, couldn't go. His neighbour said, Ah, Don Pedro, how wonderful. Your boy's injuries saved him from conscription. Now he'll be here to help you and will not risk his life on the battlefield. What a blessing. Don Pedro just shrugged and said, maybe. The story goes on, but I'm sure you get the idea. Don Pedro's life is that much better than his neighbours because of how he sees life. His outlook keeps him off the emotional roller coaster and he moves forward steadily instead. To even things out for ourselves, it's most important to take care of the downside because character isn't tested when your circumstances are at their best. When you're in a truly tight spot, then you'll learn something about yourself. For this, I'm going to give you a set of rescue questions that will allow you to shrug and say, maybe, when life gives you trouble. First, ask yourself, what's good about this? The answer might be, nothing. Or you might get something constructive. In either case, move on to the next question. What could be good about this? Now, this is a slightly easier question than the previous one. Given that there are bad things in the situation, could there be good things too? What might they be? What can I learn from this? Learning from our struggles is part of what creates an upward spiral in life. Even if you only learn to avoid that situation in future, that's still useful. If I had this to do over again, what could I do differently? You might encounter this type of situation again. Use this as a test run and figure out how you could turn it around if you had to. Explore. Recall a recent incident where things went wrong. Use the rescue questions one by one to draw positive learning from that incident. Note down what you'd learned. Review only the learnings the next day, not the incident itself, to move forward positively. This is truly alchemy, turning the lead bricks of failure into shining gold. This is one of the patterns of success. More of this in my Mastering Success course. Exaggerate, then exaggerate 1,000,000 times more. Exaggeration is a key pattern in comedy. While you're not here to become some kind of comedian, it's a really useful pattern to use in some situations, especially situations where you could use a laugh. Think about it. If you find yourself laughing in a situation that used to bother you, something important has happened to change things. That thing could be exaggeration. An old friend of mine was gloomy a lot of the time. I remember his reaction when a girl told him that he was a pessimist. He insisted that he wasn't a pessimist, but was a realist, and was just telling it like it is. So, we're doomed is realistic, is it? She retorted. You can use exaggeration on any bad internal dialogue you have, especially if you tell yourself off by running internal tape loops of someone else tearing you down. Here's how. Explore. Pick some internal dialogue that annoys you and change it. Shrink the person down with a squeaky tiny voice. Exaggerate any accent. Pick any words that are overused and exaggerate them. Speed the voice up. Now slow it down instead. Which of these do you prefer? Do any of them make you laugh? Use a better voice. Sometimes it's not what you're saying to yourself. The advice can be good. Perhaps it's how you're saying it. You're more likely to consider feedback or advice when it's delivered in a friendly, calm, or sensible tone of voice rather than a hostile or abrasive one. Let's change that now. Explore. Pick a helpful thing you say to yourself. Change the tone of voice to a calm voice, a sexy voice, the voice of a trusted friend, the voice of your favourite film star. Which of these brings out the best in you? Part 2, Summary. Being aware of and in control of your internal dialogue is really important because it can make all the difference to your focus, your mood, and your resourcefulness. You now have 4 ways of changing your internal dialogue so it stops getting in your way and begins helping you instead. Work with each of them before moving on to part 3.